This blitz game from Alireza Firouzja against Jorden van Foreest teaches us to never give up. There are a lot of mistakes in this game, an abnormal number of mistakes, even in a blitz game, considering the level of the players. But this game isn't about mistakes. It's about grit. It's about when you're not doing well, fighting through and winning in the end. This is a character game. This is a game about the character of the players. So let's take a look at this. This is at the Super United Blitz. Alireza Firouzja has white. Jorden van Foreest has black. Let's begin. D4, D5, C4, C6, the Slav defense. Knight F3, Knight F6, E3, the slow line of the Slav. Bishop to F5, Knight to C3, E6, and Knight to H4. Firouzja goes after the two bishops right off out of the gate. Bishop to E4. If Bishop G4, just Queen to B3. And white gains space and has a decent position. Bishop to E4, F3, Bishop to G6, Queen to B3, hitting the B7 pawn, Queen to B6, Bishop to D2, and Knight B to D7. If Queen takes B3, A B3, Bishop to C2, and Black will be putting a lot of pressure on White's queen side. That probably was the better way to go. But Knight B to D7 was played. Long castling, Queen B3, A B3, Bishop to B4, Knight G6, H, G6. So we get our first sort of imbalance in the position. White now has the two bishops, Firouzja, and Jorden van Foreest has the half-open H file with the rook placed on it. The bishops are more valuable in this position for sure. Bishop to E2, long castling from Black, King to C2, and G5. Jorden van Foreest begins to gain space on the king side. H3, not only does it stop G4, but it also blunts the rook at H8. But Jorden van Foreest spots this weak square at G3 and is going to try to take advantage of it. Bishop to D6 comes back to aim at that square. Bishop to E1 to defend it. Knight to H5, aiming at it. Bishop goes to D3. Bishop G3. Black would love to trade off one of the bishops for each side because then White wouldn't have the bishop pair. So Firouzja doesn't want that, so he moves the bishop back. Bishop goes to C7, now Knight to E2. The Knight helps control G3. The Knight jumps in, they are exchanged. Rook H to F1. White might want to play E4 and maybe open up the F file. Knight to F6, Bishop to C3, and Knight to H5. See, Jorden van Foreest has a really intense focus on this G3 square. His minor pieces are just aiming right at it. Rook to D2, Bishop to C7. Rook to A1, hitting the A pawn. Pawn goes to A6. Now rook to F2. And the threat of E4 is very real. So Black plays F5 to clamp down on the E4 square. White plays E4. And now Knight to F4. Hits the bishop at D3 and the pawn at G2. Both are defended, but Black would love to get rid of that bishop. And it turns out Alireza should have let him do that. Just take the pawn at F5. And that was really his best idea. And now after bishop to F1, which is what he played, he loses a pawn. Pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes. So Black has an extra pawn. Now the pawns are quite weak, but they can't be captured just yet. And this pawn on E4 could really create some real problems for Alireza. G3, that's another mistake. Rook to E1 was probably a pretty good idea. But G3 is another mistake. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification for future videos. So after G3, E3 was played. The best idea here is actually Knight to H5, hitting that G3 pawn, the knight and the bishop. Then when the pawn moves, the knight comes into F4, and now that's a permanent weakness. The knight cannot be kicked out by a pawn. But E3 is played, hitting the rook. The rook goes to H2. And even here, rook to F3 looks like the better option after E2, pawn takes, knight. That would have been the better way for White to handle it. But the rook goes to H2, which it makes sense. He wants to control the square in front of the pawn. But now the knight goes to H5. This pawn is attacked twice, and there is a pin along this diagonal. So the rook has to go to E2, and now knight to G3. And Jorden van Foreest wins another pawn, and his advantage against Alireza is really growing to decisive proportions now. Rook takes E3. Now, Alireza is just lost. Plain and simple, he is lost in this position, but there's a lot of drama left in this game, believe me. Rook D to F8 was played. Computers show that the move G4, sacrificing the pawn for activity, is the stronger idea. And after pawn takes, rook to h2 check was a good way for white to proceed. But he plays rook d to f8 instead. Bishop to d3, rook takes h3. So black is 2 pawns up. Three of them are weak, but 2 of them are passed. Rook takes e6, regains one of those pawns. Rook to h2 check, king to b1. And here, in this position, black makes an unbelievable blunder. This is what they call a double blindness, where both sides make a big blunder. Jorden van Foreest plays rook to f1 check. Rook to f3 was the better idea. Rook to f1 check, and Alireza can just take the rook. But in his brain, he probably didn't think that his opponent would ever just hang a rook like that. So he doesn't take the rook, even though it's completely winning. This is just totally winning for Alireza. But instead, he plays king to a2, and I'm sure shortly after this, he was kicking himself for missing this opportunity. So he's been losing for a while. He had a chance to completely win the game, and then he missed it. Rook takes, rook h1, king to a2. So now we're still in our endgame situation. Rook to d1 hits the bishop, bishop c2, rook c1, bishop to b1. g4, the pawn advances. Rook to e8 check to get behind the pawns. After king d7, rook to g8. So he's placing his rook, Alireza is, behind these g-pawns. Knight to e2, again looking to take away the advantage of the 2 bishops by taking the bishop at c3. Rook to g7 check, king c8, rook g8. He plays a couple of moves now, bishop to d2 to avoid that exchange. Rook to f1, rook to g7 check, king c8, rook g8, king d7, and rook takes g4. So Alireza has fought back to this position where he's got the 2 bishops and an extra pawn. But as it turns out, this is an equal game. Basically, this is a game black should draw. And the reason is because the pawns are all on one side of the board, and he has very active pieces. This knight and rook are very active. So even though Alireza has fought back to what looks like a winning position, it isn't winning. This is still a technical draw. Black has to get the draw, but on the board it really is one. Bishop to f4, offering to exchange bishops. He's been trying to do that the whole game. Rook to g7 check, king c8, and here Alireza misses another good move, rook to f7, creating a pin on the f-file and basically totally freezes black's pieces in place. He can just play d4 or d4, d5, d6. He can play the bishop at b1 to d3 to hit the knight, and looks like Firouzja is just winning in that position, so he doesn't get that move. He plays bishop to d3 instead. Bishop takes d2, bishop takes e2. So now the 2 bishops are gone, and we have opposite colored bishops, and the position is still a draw, but he's got a pawn, and he's got his rook on the 7th rank, so he has to see if he can get any headway out of that. Rook to f2, hitting the bishop. Rook to e7, defends the bishop and keeps the king on the back rank, but king d8, rook e4, bishop to b4, king b1, bishop d6, king c2. Alireza begins to activate his king. Rook to f4, and king to d3. Notice he doesn't take the rook. He plays his king to d3 and lets black do it, and after rook takes, now his king is in a much better place. He's basically gained 2 tempos with the king by doing it that way. And many people would write this off as a draw, and there's no doubt from a technical perspective it is. It is a pure opposite-colored bishop endgame with pawns on one side of the board. c5 was played by black, and if white plays d5, then that's it. The king would just go to e7, and the bishop would just stay on this diagonal. Even with this protected passed pawn, white can make 0 progress. That would be a draw. So instead, Alireza plays king to d5, a stronger move, hitting the pawn at c5 and the bishop at d6. The bishop moves to e7 and dc5. Now Alireza is up 2 pawns, and it's still a technical draw. Can he squeeze out the win? Can he make his opponent make a mistake? a5. c6, and here again, b6 was a strong move. You could just play the king to c7. Jorden van Foreest could just play the bishop to c5, and there would be no way for white to make progress. King to c7, pawn takes, king takes b7, king to c5, king to c7, king to c4, bishop to f6, hitting the pawn at b2, king to b5, bishop to d4, keeping pressure on this pawn, so if Alireza takes on a5, black could just take that pawn, like so. And this, of course, is an absolute dead draw. No progress could be made. After bishop to f3, there are many ways for black to hold this position. He can move the king to d8, king to d7, king d8. He can't take the pawn at b2 because then king to a5, and then white is winning. But instead, Jorden van Foreest makes a move that doesn't look like much, but it completely loses the game. Bishop to e3. It looks like a strong move, but because he's no longer putting pressure on b2, Alireza can win this if he plays perfectly from this point out. b4 to liquidate the pawn. a b4, king b4, king to b8, king to b5, king to a7, b4. And now black is in big trouble. Alireza is going to use these two pawns to control the dark squares, use the bishop to control the light squares, and black is in big trouble. Bishop to d2, king c4. There's a lot of maneuvering. And now he advances to b5. And now we see the pawns controlling the dark squares, the bishop at f3 controlling the light squares. Bishop to h4, bishop e7, bishop to e7, king b5. Some more maneuvering. Now c6. And bishop to d8. And Firouzja plays bishop to h3. Now, it would be a terrible blunder to play c7 check here, because then the bishop would take the pawn, and pawn takes, and this would be a draw. King and bishop versus king is a draw. But he plays bishop to h3, and now black is in zugzwang, which means compulsion to move. It basically means black would like to just leave his pieces where they're at. If black didn't have to move, this would be a draw. But because he has to move, he loses. If he moves the bishop away, then the pawn will just advance and queen. So he plays the king to a8, but then c7. And there's nothing he can do. Either the pawn is going to go to c8 and promote, or it's going to take the bishop, or the bishop will take, but then there's nothing to be done to stop it because the bishop on h3 controls that square. And that is it, and Jorden van Foreest resigned. A real, genuine chess fight from beginning to end. There were mistakes. There was back and forth. This was a character win for Alireza Firouzja. Now, even after going over this great game from Alireza, there is still some great chess that you're missing out on. To fix that, be sure to check out this game right here. It's really going to give you some mind-blowing chess from Alireza.